It was September 12, 1935, at exactly 11:47 p.m., and the air on 125th Street hung heavy with the humidity of a dying summer and the metallic scent of impending violence. Harlem was not sleeping. Harlem was holding its breath. The streetlights flickered against the wet pavement, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to dance to the rhythm of a silent war drums. To the uninitiated, it was just another night in the Black Mecca, but to those who knew the heartbeat of the asphalt, the tension was suffocating. There was a war for the soul of the city, a brutal chess match played with bullets and blood between the erratic, frothing madness of the Jewish mobster Dutch Schultz and the elegant, ironclad resolve of the Queen of Numbers, Stephanie St. Clair. But standing between the Queen and the rabid dog at the gate was not an army, but a single man, a man who moved through the chaos with the silence of a panther stalking through tall grass. They called him Bumpy. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson sat in the back of the Lenox Lounge, a glass of lukewarm water in front of him, his eyes scanning the room with a detachment that was more terrifying than any shout of anger. He was a study in contradictions, a man of profound intellect who could quote Shakespeare and philosophy with the same ease that he could shatter a man's jaw. On this particular night, the word on the street was that Dutch Schultz, the beer baron of the Bronx, had finally lost his patience. The Dutchman, realizing he could not intimidate the Queen, had placed a $50,000 bounty on the head of her enforcer. $50,000 in 1935 was enough to buy a kingdom, or at least enough to turn a loyal friend into a Judas. Every two-bit hustler with a rusty revolver was looking at Bumpy Johnson and seeing a winning lottery ticket. Most men would have gone to the mattresses, hiding in the fortified basements of 409 Edgecombe Avenue, surrounded by guards and waiting for the storm to pass. But Bumpy Johnson did not hide. Bumpy Johnson did not run. He understood something that Schultz, with all his manic energy and brute force, never grasped. Power is not about who shoots first. Power is about who decides when the shooting stops. Earlier that evening, a shadow had moved in the alleyway behind Bumpy's favorite tailor shop. A hired gun, a nervous kid from Hell's Kitchen looking to make a name for himself, had taken a shot at the Godfather. The bullet had missed, chipping the brickwork inches from Bumpy's ear. The boy had panicked, his nerve failing him in the presence of the legend, and he had fled into the darkness, leaving behind nothing but the smell of fear and a silver Zippo lighter that had slipped from his trembling fingers. Bumpy had picked up the lighter, turning it over in his large, calloused hands. It was engraved with a crude DS. It wasn't the boy's lighter, it was a token, a piece of party favor given out to Schultz's lieutenants. It was a message, and Bumpy intended to send a reply. The clock struck midnight as Bumpy stood up, smoothing the lapels of his immaculate charcoal suit. He didn't check for his gun. In fact, he left his piece on the table, a gesture of supreme arrogance that made his own bodyguards exchange nervous glances. He walked out of the Lenox Lounge and stepped into his car, ordering the driver to take him not to safety, but downtown. He was heading to the Embassy Club, the fortress where Dutch Schultz held court, surrounded by a legion of trigger-happy sociopaths. The drive was silent, the city passing by in a blur of neon and darkness. Bumpy sat perfectly still, his mind moving 5 moves ahead on the board. He knew that Schultz was a checker player in a world that demanded a grand master. Schultz saw the immediate kill, the quick profit, the blood on the floor. Bumpy saw the flow of influence, the delicate balance of alliances, and the ultimate checkmate that required sacrificing a pawn to capture a king. When the car pulled up to the Embassy Club, the doormen, massive Irish brawlers with cauliflower ears, stiffened. They knew who he was. Everyone knew who he was. The sight of Bumpy Johnson, unarmed and alone, walking calmly toward the entrance of his enemy's stronghold was so surreal, so utterly defying the laws of survival, that they were paralyzed by confusion. He didn't sneak in. He didn't kick the door down. He simply walked past them with a nod, as if he were the owner inspecting the premises. The silence that followed him into the main room was absolute. The clinking of glasses stopped. The jazz band faltered and died out. The air was sucked out of the room as 50 pairs of eyes landed on the tall, dark-skinned man standing in the center of the white mob's sanctuary. Dutch Schultz was sitting at his usual corner table, a napkin tucked into his collar, grease on his chin, laughing loudly at some sycophant's joke. When he saw Bumpy, the laughter died in his throat, replaced by a shade of purple rage that started at his neck and consumed his face. Schultz's hand twitched toward his shoulder holster, and instantly a dozen Thompson submachine guns were leveled at Bumpy. The sound of bolts racking back echoed like thunder in a canyon. But Bumpy didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. His heartbeat remained steady, a slow, rhythmic thrum against his ribs. He looked at the guns pointed at him with a mild curiosity, as if they were interesting artifacts rather than instruments of death. He kept his hands visible, moving them slowly, deliberately. "You're a long way from Harlem, boy," Schultz spat, his voice trembling with a mixture of fury and disbelief. "You come here to die? You come here to collect the bullet I owe you?" Bumpy smiled, a cold, thin expression that didn't reach his eyes. His eyes were arctic, void of fear, filled only with a terrifying calculation. "No, Dutch," Bumpy said, his voice a rich baritone that carried to the back of the room without him raising it a single decibel. "I came to return something you lost." Slowly, with the grace of a magician, Bumpy reached into his pocket. The bodyguards tensed, fingers tightening on triggers. If he had pulled a gun, he would have been cut in half before it cleared his pocket. But he didn't pull a gun. He pulled out the silver Zippo lighter. He held it up, letting the chandeliers catch the gleam of the metal, and then with a flick of his wrist, he tossed it onto the table in front of Schultz. It spun and rattled, coming to a stop right next to Schultz's half-eaten steak. "You boy dropped this tonight," Bumpy said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a whisper that roared. "He tried to do your dirty work, Arthur. He missed. I assume he's still running, but I wanted you to have this back. It's bad luck to lose fire." Schultz stared at the lighter, then up at Bumpy. The implication hit him like a physical blow. Bumpy Johnson had walked into the most heavily guarded room in New York City, unarmed, to return a lighter. The message was clear, written in the air between them. "I can get to you. Walls don't matter. Guns don't matter. Numbers don't matter. If I wanted you dead, you would already be dead. You are alive right now, only because I allow it." It was a psychological castration performed in front of Schultz's entire crew. The realization dawned on the men in the room. They looked from the sweating, manic Dutchman to the statue-still Bumpy Johnson, and they saw the difference between a boss and a king.
"Get him out of here!"
Schultz screamed, sweeping his dinner onto the floor, his bravado shattering under the weight of Bumpy's gaze.
"Kill him! No, get him out! Someone shoot him!"
But nobody fired. To shoot a man who showed this level of courage, this level of disdain for death, felt wrong, even to murderers. It felt like shooting a ghost. Bumpy didn't wait for them to decide. He turned his back on Dutch Schultz, the ultimate insult, and walked out the way he came. He didn't run. He didn't look back. He walked through the valley of the shadow of death and feared no evil, because he was the most dangerous thing in the valley. As he stepped back into the cool night air, Bumpy knew the game had shifted. He had humiliated Schultz, and a man like Schultz would burn down the world to hide his shame. But that was exactly what Bumpy wanted. He needed Schultz reckless. He needed Schultz to become a liability not just to Harlem, but to the Commission. The next morning, Bumpy didn't go to the trenches. he went to a quiet Italian restaurant on the Lower East Side. He sat down across from a man with a scarred face and a drooping eye. Charles "Lucky" Luciano. The meeting between Bumpy and Luciano was the stuff of legends, a convergence of two master strategists who spoke the same language of power. Bumpy didn't ask for help. He offered a solution. He laid out the board for Luciano. Schultz was bringing heat, drawing attention from the feds, disrupting business with his wild violence. He was a mad dog that needed to be put down. Bumpy offered Luciano a deal. The Italians could have a piece of the numbers, but Harlem remained under Bumpy's protection. No Italian soldiers on 125th Street. Bumpy would run the show, and he would ensure peace and profit. In exchange, the commission had to lift the protection on Schultz. Luciano listened, sipping his espresso. He looked at Bumpy and saw a mirror image of himself, a man who understood that true organized crime required organization, not chaos. "You're a smart man, Bumpy," Luciano said finally. "Schultz is a headache, a loud headache. Maybe it's time for some quiet." The pact was sealed not with blood, but with a nod. Bumpy had looked 5 moves ahead. He knew he couldn't win a shooting war against the entire mafia, so he used diplomacy to isolate his enemy. He turned the chessboard around so that his enemy's allies became his own pawns. Weeks later, on October 23, 1935, the end game played out exactly as Bumpy had foreseen. Dutch Schultz sat in the Palace Chop House in Newark, convinced he was plotting his comeback, convinced he was untouchable. He was crying into his beer, ranting about Bumpy Johnson, about the lighter, about the disrespect. He never saw the end coming. When the hitmen from Murder, Inc. burst in, sent by the commission that Bumpy had negotiated with, Schultz didn't die like a soldier. He died confused, raving, a victim of his own inability to see the bigger picture. Back in Harlem, the news spread like wildfire. The beer baron was dead. The threat was gone. Bumpy Johnson stood on the balcony of 409 Edgecombe, looking out over the lights of Harlem. He hadn't fired the shot that killed Schultz. He hadn't needed to. He had orchestrated the death of his greatest enemy without dirtying his hands, using the weight of the underworld against itself. He turned back into the apartment where Stephanie St. Clair was waiting. The Queen was retiring, stepping back from the front lines. She looked at Bumpy, the man who had walked into the lion's den with a lighter, the man who had outthought the mob. "The city is yours, Bumpy," she said softly. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply nodded, the weight of the crown settling onto his shoulders. He was the godfather of Harlem now. He had proven that a black man in 1930s America could not only survive against the most powerful criminal organizations in the world, but could dictate terms to them. He had shown that while violence is the language of the desperate, silence is the language of the powerful. The legend of the lighter became a parable told on street corners and in barbershops for decades. Old men would lean in close, their voices hushed, and tell the young bloods about the night Bumpy Johnson walked into hell and put out the devil's fire. They would talk about the suit, the walk, the eyes that could freeze water. But the true lesson wasn't about bravery. It was about the mind. It was about the fact that while Dutch Schultz was playing checkers, jumping one piece at a time, Bumpy Johnson was playing 3-dimensional chess, controlling the board before the first pawn was even moved. This is the Bumpy Johnson they don't teach you in history books. This is the man who didn't just break the law, he rewrote it. He was a criminal, yes, but in the context of a society that denied his people every avenue of legitimate power, he was a titan. He was the barrier between the wolves and the sheep. He was the official, unofficial mayor of Harlem, who ruled not by the ballot, but by the bullet and the brain. And on that September night, when he left that lighter on the table, he didn't just return a piece of metal. He announced the arrival of a king. So ask yourself, when you walk the streets of Harlem today and feel the history in the pavement, who really won? The man who died screaming in a chop house in New Jersey, or the man who died an old man in a restaurant in Wells, surrounded by his people, having lived a life on his own terms? Bumpy Johnson showed us that the most dangerous weapon a man can carry isn't a gun in his waistband, but the absolute, unshakable belief in his own sovereignty. He was the Grand Master, and the game was never rigged against him. He was just waiting for the right moment to topple the king.